Do you ever do things that you know you probably shouldn't do? Like eat an entire chocolate cake instead of eating just one piece. I mean, those kinds of things, right? You do things and you just know that you're going to pay for them later. Well, I am an allergy sufferer, right? And I slept with the windows open last night. But it was a good night to do that, right? But we're going to see. I think everything is settled down. I think we're good, right? But I think we're going to be okay this morning. As I do my sermon this morning, I want to tell you that I am going to work off of three premises. Three different premises for my sermon this morning, okay? The first one is Jesus meets us in our everyday lives and shows us grace and mercy. Now that's nothing new. Y'all know that. Y'all have experienced that. But we're going to talk about that a little bit this morning. My second premise is that Jesus is a pretty sly guy. Okay? And then my third premise is that I think Jesus once lived in Oklahoma. Okay? So whoever prayed for the Texas fans, you need to know that I'm from Oklahoma and I was thrilled that Texas lost yesterday. But it's good. It's all good. But I think at some point, Jesus lived in Oklahoma, and I'm going to tell you about that here in just a minute. Okay? The setting for our gospel reading today is established in verse 1, where we read, on one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath. That's what's happening in our gospel reading this morning. There's a meal taking place. And the relationship that Jesus had with the Pharisees was actually a pretty complex one. This is not the first time in the book of Luke that Jesus dines with a Pharisee. It's actually the third time recorded in Luke that Jesus does this. Some of the Pharisees had chastised Jesus for doing everything from dining with sinners and tax collectors to working on the Sabbath as he healed people. And as we know, the Pharisees accused Jesus of doing a lot of things. And yet Jesus continued to dine with them. He continued to engage in conversation with them. Others in attendance at this meal were obviously considered the social elite. And we know that because of how they are acting and because of the comparison that Jesus makes when he tells the host later to invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. But here was Jesus. Not a man of means, but a man becoming very well known in the community for what he was saying and for what he was doing. I said that some of the Pharisees chastised Jesus. There were also some who were amazed by his power to heal and to forgive. And then there were others, probably not exclusive of those first two categories, the combatants and the admirers. There were some who even warned Jesus when Herod wanted to kill him. Luke records those conversations earlier in the gospel. So when the gospel today read, on one occasion when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. They, the Pharisees, had different motives for watching Jesus. Some were waiting for him to slip up, to break the law, or at least their interpretation of the law. Somewhere in the midst, there were Pharisees ready to warn Jesus in case any threats arose, while others were waiting to hear what he would say and do because they were curious and they wanted to be witnesses to any miracles or students of any lessons that he may offer. It's that last group that I want to focus on for just a second. Let me propose for just a moment that it would not be a stretch to think that some of the Pharisees were jockeying for a position near the head of the table to sit closer to the host because they knew that Jesus would be seated at the head, or closer, not at the head, but closer to the host. Because what better place to put someone who was being watched by so many than to put them up front, right? And if Jesus was nearer to the front, wouldn't you want to sit closer so that you could hear what Jesus was saying? Wouldn't you want to be closer in case Jesus healed someone and you could be witness to that? Last weekend I was up in Mansfield. I went hiking at Cuyahoga Falls for 3 days with some friends, and we went to Mansfield on the way home, and we took a self-guided tour of the prison where Shawshank Redemption was recorded, right? You remember that movie? At some point there was a tour guide that came through, and there was a long line of tourists that were following him. The guide was talking as he walked along the way, and it made me wonder about the people at the end of the line. Could they hear him? Could they see what he was pointing at as he walked along and did the tour? If you were a tourist, don't you want to be near the guide so that you can learn as much as you possibly can? If you were a guest at the dinner that we read about, wouldn't you want to be closer to Jesus to learn from him? Well, everyone at this dinner had differing motives, which takes us to my first premise, that Jesus meets us in our everyday lives, showing us grace and mercy. Jesus knows our true hearts. Jesus knew that some of the Pharisees had varying motives for watching him. This didn't keep him from dining with them or engaging them in dialogue. It didn't keep him from teaching them or guiding them. Whether the Pharisees were curious or conspiring, Jesus was still at the table. This parable about where to sit at a banquet encouraged those listening to think about what was in their hearts and what was driving their actions. Purpose, not pride. Humility, not arrogance. Others over self. Jesus doesn't write us off when we get those things wrong. He encourages us to think differently so that we can get those things right. There's an element to this story that actually makes me giggle. It's the fact that while the Pharisees were watching Jesus, he was also watching them. You can learn a lot about people simply by watching them and how they interact in the midst of a group of people. For example, I work out at Planet Fitness. A person who takes the time to wipe down the equipment after they are done strikes me as being someone who thinks of others and who follows the rules. People who habitually sit on the equipment and scroll for 10 minutes on their phone without any regard for the fact that I need to get onto that machine, right, suggests that they are a bit self-centered. Same for those who refuse to put the floor mats back up on the hooks when they are done. That is a simple thing to do, okay? But I see those people not doing that. I only know the names of a few people at the gym, but as I watch them, I learn a lot about them. The difference in my reaction as I watch them is quite different from Jesus' reaction with the Pharisees. When someone is sitting on the equipment for too long, my blood pressure, right, just goes up. And I complain to my workout partner. When Jesus sees someone vying for a favored seat at this meal, he takes the time to turn it into a teaching moment. See, Jesus was in the business of people watching his entire earthly ministry. He watched as a woman came to the well to gather water. He watched as a father made his way through the crowd when his daughter was dying. He watched as friends brought a friend so they could lower a stretcher down for Jesus to see. He watched as his disciples told parents to keep their children at bay. He watched as his friends slept in a garden while he prayed. I really like the way that the Message Bible interprets this story, beginning with Jesus' words to the guests and then moving on to what Jesus says to the host. This is the way that this is interpreted in the Message Bible. What I Jesus, am saying is, if you walk around all high and mighty, you're going to end up flat on your face. But if you're content to simply be yourself, you will become more than yourself. Then he turned to the host. The next time you put on a dinner, don't just invite your friends and your family and your rich neighbors, the kind of people who will return the favor. Invite some people who never get invited out, the misfits from the wrong side of the tracks. You'll be and experience a blessing. They won't be able to return the favor, but the favor will be returned. Oh, how it will be returned at the resurrection of God's people. See, Jesus is sly in how he reacts in this scene, because his words are not just about a dinner at a table. His words are not just about proper party etiquette. His words are intended to save us from ourselves. Jesus is constantly trying to protect us from self-inflicted wounds, like leaving the windows open or eating the entire chocolate cake, right? One of the best ways to do this is to think beyond ourselves and to think of others, to think of those who are lonely and looked down upon and who often don't get invited to the party. Now, I'm going to tell you this next story, not because I think that I did anything great. I didn't. It was a simple gesture. But this was as much a learning moment for myself as it was a chance to do something nice for somebody else, right? It was a great reminder for the preacher to practice what I preach. That's the point of this story. Okay? About 2 weeks ago, I and a group of friends, to include Michelle, we went to a concert one night over at Smith Gardens in Oakwood. If you have never been to Smith Gardens, Google it and go, because it is a beautiful little garden tucked in the midst of the neighborhoods of Oakwood, right? Beautiful. It's beautiful year-round. And all of the people who take care of this garden, they're all volunteers. All of the caretakers are. So my group, when we got there, we set up chairs, we set up a small table, and we had snacks, which we put out on the table. When we go listen to music, we go in style, right? We have our chairs, we have our table, we have our food, we have all of that. So we put all of these snacks out. And there were many families that were there, which meant that there were a lot of children running around making joyful noises, like we heard just a moment ago, right? All these kids were playing and stuff. So Patty, who was with us, she invited, there was a small cohort of girls that had a blanket right near us. And Patty invited those girls to take some snacks, which they did. In fact, they almost wiped out our snacks because they kept coming back and back and back. It was awesome. It was great, right? Kids were running around, they were playing, they were laughing, they were chasing one another. You get the scene, right? This is what was happening. Well, during the evening, there was one little girl who caught my attention. And she was maybe 6 years old, give or take. She had a head full of black hair, and she had on a purple tutu. So she was playing by herself, and none of the other kids invited her to join in with what they were doing. So at one point, there's a creek that runs through, this is a small little creek that runs through Smith Garden. At one point, this little girl went over and started to play in that creek, which she saw all of the other kids doing. I mean, they were jumping over and playing in the creek. Well, two girls were with two adults were with this little girl. They were a little bit older, so I'm going to call them Grandma and Grandpa. Okay, we're there. Grandpa came over to the little girl as she was playing in the creek, and he told her rather firmly that she needed to not play in the water, even though all of the other kids were. The little girl got upset, and she started crying. So Grandpa picked her up, gave her a hug, and took her back to a blanket, which is where Grandma was sitting. Well, I felt sad for this little girl, mostly because all of the other kids were playing, and she seemed to be all alone in what she was doing. So I grabbed one of our snacks. We had the little halos, the little clementines, right, the little oranges. I grabbed one of those, and I walked around the creek, nice and slow. And as I walked up to this family, the girl can't see me, right, because Grandpa's hugging her, so I'm behind Grandpa. And I caught the eye of Grandma. And I mouthed, "Can you have this?" And Grandma waved me off, but it was more like, no, it's okay, it's Grandpa saw me and he did the same thing. No, it's not necessary. So I walked back to my seat holding that little clementine. Fairly quickly, when I got back to my seat, Patty leaned over and she whispered something in my ear. She said, "What you just did spoke louder than any sermon that you will ever preach." And what she said made my heart smile. It was a reminder that when we put other people's needs in front of our own, when we notice those who are sad and we offer them a kind gesture, when we take a moment to simply see someone, we are blessed. Jesus was well aware of this at the dinner that he was attending. Now on to my third premise. You may be a little intrigued when I tell you that I think that Jesus lived in Oklahoma at one point. Let me tell you what I mean by this. See, I'm originally from Oklahoma. I told you that. And when I was in high school, there were two couples who were the adult leaders of the youth group that I attended as part of the Methodist Church. One of those couples was Lewis and Frances Stiles. And because of some dysfunction in my family of origin, Lewis and Frances became very instrumental in my life, being like adopted parents to me, if you will. I always went to their house once I left high school, college. I always went to their house for holidays. Their kids sent me birthday cards that said, "Happy birthday, sis," all of that, right? I truly became part of their family. And I often tell people that if it weren't for Lewis and Frances, I would be in a corner somewhere, curled up in a fetal position like humming Gilligan's Island or something. I just would not be the person that I am today if it were not for Lewis and Frances. And in high school, I was very shy. I was very awkward. I was smart, but I was not popular by anyone's definition. I was not athletic. I was not musical. My family did not have a lot of money. I did not have a lot of opportunities to do the things that I wanted to do in high school. But it was in church where I found that I felt valued and where I was allowed to be a leader. It was in church where I met two people who told me that I could be more and that I could do more. Lewis and Frances brought me into their family in every sense of the word. And our relationship remained that way up until their deaths. Frances died in 2004 of ovarian cancer, and Lewis died in 2018 because of some heart failure. When Frances died, I was with the family before her funeral, and the topic of who would sit where during the funeral came up. So Myrna and Mary Lee and Bob, who were their daughters and son, they decided that they would sit in birth order by Lewis on the front row, and then their families would fall in the rows behind them, and then Frances's sister was there and other people were there. And at one point in the discussion, I could tell that Lewis and others were trying to decide where I would sit. They loved me, but I didn't quite fit into a specific category when it comes to funeral sitting, right? So I took the lead, and I looked each one in the eye, and I told them that it didn't matter where I sat, because it was simply my honor to be in that room. I truly believe that people can see Jesus in us when we share his love with them and with others. Lewis and Frances exemplified what Jesus taught about offering a seat at the table to those who otherwise would not be invited. They helped a young girl who didn't quite fit in with her family or her peers and made that young girl feel valued. They made me feel worthy. That's why I think Jesus lived in Oklahoma. He lived in the hearts of Lewis and Frances, and they in turn helped me understand the importance of having Jesus live in my heart. Well, in our scripture today, Jesus plays the role of the guest at the Sabbath dinner, but his words and his actions foreshadow his role as the host at the table. Do this. Where he would break bread with his disciples, where he would say, "Take and eat and drink and do this in remembrance of me." As we join together in communion this morning, we come remembering that Jesus meets us in our everyday lives. No matter where you are in your walk with God, you are welcome at this table. We come remembering that Jesus only wants the best for us. He doesn't want us to feel shame or fear or that we are less than anyone else. He sees our pain, in our loneliness and in our struggles, and he calls us to see others who are also suffering. We come remembering what God has done for us and what God can do through us and what God can do through other people, whether they live in Ohio, Oklahoma, or anywhere else. We come no one better than anyone else. We come simply honored to be at this table.